a ship. It's alive. Everyone, run! Run! There are things you can't find, and places you can't enter. We broke both of those rules. They haven't disappeared. They're waiting, and now we are with them. We're not alone.
Nova Dawn was never supposed to be a paradise, but it wasn't meant to be a slow death sentence either. When the first ships landed here, the colony was a beacon of hope, an ambitious attempt to carve out a future where none should exist. It was built on the promise that human ingenuity could turn a barren wasteland into a thriving society. The settlers had believed in that promise. Scientists, workers, families, all of them convinced they were part of something bigger. They had faith in the colony's ability to endure. That faith is gone now. The sun is dying. A pale, anemic dwarf star that was already in decline when humanity arrived, but it had been stable enough, long enough for the researchers to believe they could sustain life here indefinitely with the right advancements. That optimism has long since turned to dust. The dim glow of Nova Dawn's star is fainter than ever, struggling to provide even the barest warmth. The cold nights have grown longer, the daylight weaker, the crops in the hydroponic farms withering, despite every desperate adjustment. The colony's artificial habitats are failing, their aging infrastructure deteriorating faster than the overworked engineers can repair them. The once promising settlement is now a dying husk, a place where people live not because they choose to, but because they have nowhere else to go. Felix Walker knows this truth better than most. He has seen the despair in their eyes, the gaunt faces of miners trudging back from the depleted resource fields, the hollow stares of families standing in endless ration lines. The colony administration insists that rationing will save them. They call it a necessary hardship, a short-term measure while they search for alternatives. But there are no alternatives. The hydroponics facilities have reached their limit, and every shipment of off-world supplies grows smaller and more infrequent. Hope, like everything else on Nova Dawn, is running out. Felix walks through the market, a place that should be the heart of the colony, where people trade, barter, and cling to some semblance of normal life. Instead, it is a grim reminder of how far they have fallen. The stalls are sparse, the vendors weary, their goods priced at extortionate rates. A few half-rotten vegetables, nutrient paste packets, protein bars of questionable origin. Everything is valuable. Everything is hoarded. There was a time when Felix had been respected, his name carrying weight in circles that mattered. He was a xenolinguist, one of the best, celebrated for his work deciphering the languages of lost civilizations. He had studied the ancient scripts of the Xantus, unraveled the complex, mathematically intricate grammar of the Yari. His findings had been displayed in the grand halls of academia, his research heralded as groundbreaking. Now he is nothing more than a junk peddler, a man who trades in desperation. Information, contraband, off-world relics, anything that can be sold, anything that can buy him another day aboard the Star Seeker. the rusted, barely functioning ship he calls home. The colony administrators call Nova Dawn a settlement, but Felix knows the truth. It is a slow-motion extinction event. The people here are ghosts, waiting to disappear. He has seen the tension rising, simmering just beneath the surface. The laborers, the ones who mine the last remnants of Nova Dawn's resources, who extract minerals from a dying world that gives less and less each day, are reaching their breaking point. Felix saw it during his last trade run, in the way their eyes burned with something new, something dangerous. There was once only exhaustion in their gaze. Now there is anger. They have been squeezed too hard for too long. The rations have been cut again. The oxygen scrubbers in the lower districts are failing. The wealthy still eat well, still have power, still live in the artificial towers that rise above the slums. It was only a matter of time before people pushed back. Felix has been in enough places like this to know the signs. It won't be long before Nova Dawn burns. And then there's Wexler. Even now, after all these years, Felix cannot hear the name without feeling a spike of rage. A name that once belonged to a friend, a colleague, a man who once shared his vision. Now, Wexler is nothing more than a bitter reminder of the past, a betrayal that never stopped bleeding. They had worked together once, researching a potential solution to Nova Dawn's energy crisis. A breakthrough, a way to harness stellar energy that could have saved them all. But Wexler had been impatient. He wanted recognition. He twisted their research, rushed the results, ignored Felix's warnings. The reactor breach that followed was catastrophic. A massive explosion, a blinding white firestorm that tore through the facility and left behind a scar of irradiated wasteland, an uninhabitable stretch of land that still poisons the air. When the dust settled, when the flames burned out, Felix was the one they blamed. The Walker catastrophe, they called it. Felix Walker, the reckless scientist, the fraud. He had been expelled, disgraced, his career turned to ashes. Meanwhile, Wexler walked away unscathed. He had spun the narrative beautifully, the cautious hero who tried to stop his reckless colleague. He had positioned himself as the victim, and the colony believed him. Felix often wonders where Wexler is now. Safe, probably. Comfortable. Sitting in some high-rise on Luna, sipping imported drinks and basking in the praise of the very people who ruined Felix's life. He wonders if Wexler ever thinks about the people still trapped here, if he thinks about the thousands who suffer while he thrives. Felix doubts it. Still, it doesn't matter now. What matters is what's ahead. The Starseeker's engines groan beneath him as he makes his way back to the ship. He doesn't belong here. Not anymore. Nova Dawn is a graveyard in the making, and he has no intention of being buried with it. His crew, if you could call them that, are waiting. Rogan, the captain, a man worn thin by past mistakes and old regrets, watches him from the bridge, his cybernetic eye gleaming in the dim light. Wilder, the security officer, polishes his weapon in silence, always watching, always waiting for something to go wrong. Archie, the navigator, a nervous wreck with too much talent and too little confidence, flits between his screens, already anticipating their next jump. And then there's Gideon, the doctor. Cold, calculating, dangerous. Felix doesn't trust him. He doesn't trust any of them. But for now, they're all he has. Nova Dawn is crumbling, but if Felix is right, there's still a way out, and he's willing to risk everything to find it. There was a time when Felix Walker had a future, a real one. Not just survival, not just scraping by on whatever deals he could manage in the black market of Nova Dawn. Once his name had meant something. It had been spoken in halls of knowledge, whispered in research circles, printed in publications that mattered. Once he had been one of the most promising xenolinguists of his generation, a scholar whose insights into lost alien languages had shaped entire fields of study. That was before the betrayal. Before Wexler. Even now, years after the catastrophe that ended his career, the name still brought a surge of bitter resentment. Not just because of what happened, but because it should have been different. Because they had been friends. Felix had met Wexler in the academic corridors of New Albia, a research colony far from the backwater hellscape of Nova Dawn. They had both been young, both hungry for discovery, and both drawn to the same impossible dream, understanding the relics of the silicates, the one alien civilization that had left behind more questions than answers. Together, they had pored over ancient records, deciphering scripts that had defied even the most advanced computational models. They had broken barriers, revealing glimpses into a long-dead intelligence that had once reshaped the fabric of the universe itself. But Wexler was never satisfied with glimpses. He wanted proof. It wasn't enough to decode the silicate language, to map out their structures, or even to grasp the principles behind their long-vanished gravitic shear technology. Wexler wanted power, and Felix had been too blind to see it. The research had taken them to Nova Dawn, not for xenolinguistics, but for something much bigger. A chance to solve the colony's greatest crisis. Nova Dawn had been dying for years. The settlers had known it since the first hydroponic failures, since the oxygen systems began to degrade, since the sun itself dimmed like the flickering light of a candle about to be snuffed out. The energy crisis was the final nail in the coffin. The colony's power systems were failing, stretched thin by a failing infrastructure, dwindling fuel reserves, and an administration too corrupt or too incompetent to stop it. Felix had seen a way out, a solution. The silicates had mastered stellar energy manipulation, techniques that went far beyond anything humanity had ever built. Their ancient records spoke of systems capable of harnessing and stabilizing failing stars, of converting near-dead celestial bodies into sustainable energy sources. Felix and Wexler had worked together, trying to translate not just the language of the silicates, but the science hidden within it. And then Wexler stole it. Felix had been cautious, methodical. He knew that the technology was far beyond their understanding. He had warned Wexler again and again that they needed time, that rushing the process could lead to something catastrophic. But Wexler wasn't patient. He wasn't cautious. He was ambitious. And so he took their research, Felix's research, and twisted it into something unstable, dangerous, volatile. He presented it to the Nova Dawn Project Board as if it were complete, promising immediate results, claiming that they could begin testing a prototype within weeks. He wanted the credit, the recognition, the legacy that should have been Felix's. And when it all went wrong, when the reactor failed and the explosion tore through the colony, it was Felix's name that burned with it. The Walker catastrophe, they called it. Not the Wexler disaster, not Wexler's recklessness. The Walker catastrophe. They had needed someone to blame, and Wexler had given them exactly that. He had positioned himself perfectly, painting Felix as the reckless, arrogant scientist who had refused oversight, who had rushed to test unverified theories. He spun the truth into a lie so perfectly that even Felix himself struggled to separate the two. The trial had been swift. There had been no real defense, no chance to explain. By the time Felix had realized what had happened, Wexler had already sealed his fate. Felix was expelled from the project, disgraced, his credentials revoked. His research, the very work he had dedicated his life to, was destroyed, his name scrubbed from history. Meanwhile, Wexler walked away untouched. He left Nova Dawn behind, escaping the fallout, whispering about how he had tried to warn his reckless colleague, about how he had been the voice of reason in the face of Felix's blind ambition. He was probably on Luna now, enjoying a comfortable, well-funded research post, basking in the admiration of those too ignorant to see the truth. And Felix was here, stuck on a dying rock, clinging to whatever scraps of dignity he could still find. Years had passed, but the betrayal never faded. The stain never washed away. The people of Nova Dawn still spoke his name with disgust, still looked at him with resentment and distrust. In their eyes, he was still the man who had failed them, the reason the power grid never recovered, the reason so many people still lived in the cold and the dark. It didn't matter that Wexler had lied. It didn't matter that Felix had tried to stop him. The colony had needed a villain, and Wexler had given them one. Felix could have left, could have tried to disappear into the depths of space, to bury his past on some backwater world where no one knew his name. But he stayed, not because he owed Nova Dawn anything, not because he felt guilty, because he refused to let Wexler win, because he knew the truth. The research had been sound. The real solution had been there, buried beneath the layers of lies and betrayal. Wexler had taken a shortcut, had used Felix's work as a foundation for a disaster. But somewhere, in the wreckage of his ruined career, in the ruins of Nova Dawn, the answers still existed. He just had to find them. And when he did, when he proved the truth, he would drag Wexler's name through the dirt, just like Wexler had done to him. It wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about getting back what was stolen, and maybe, just maybe, saving Nova Dawn in the process. The universe has places where light itself fears to go, where even the most daring spacers whisper legends in hushed voices, afraid that speaking too loudly might wake something ancient and unforgiving. The Outer Dissolution is one of those places. We had always known it was there, lurking at the fringes of explored space, a wound in reality itself. It existed as a cautionary tale in every pilot's handbook, an abyss where ships vanished without a trace, where gravity twisted like a dying creature, and where the very laws of physics were no longer laws at all. But no one truly knew what waited inside. Until now. The Starseeker emerged from slipspace with a lurch, the ship's frame groaning under the strain. This was no ordinary jump. Even the ship itself seemed to know it was venturing into somewhere it did not belong. Beyond the viewport, the stars were wrong. They shimmered and bled into one another, their forms bending as if caught in some unseen current. Space here was not still. It churned, folded, unfolded. Every sensor on the Star Seeker was screaming nonsense, readings fluctuating so wildly that even Archie, our brilliant neurotic navigator, had stopped trying to interpret them. We were in uncharted space, a place that no ship was ever meant to enter. And yet, in the distance there was something. A structure so large it defied comprehension. A relic of the silicates. It drifted at the center of the storm, an impossible construct, as if an entire city had been carved from the bones of a dead god and left to float in the abyss. There were towers, spires, bridges connecting monolithic structures that seemed both organic and artificial. It was a ship, but it was also a tomb. The last remnant of the silicates. A graveyard of ghosts. Jesus, Wilder muttered. His voice was barely more than a breath. It's bigger than anything I've ever seen. Rogan, our captain, didn't speak. He just stared, his artificial eye dimly reflecting the unfathomable thing in front of us. I had spent my life chasing the silicates, studying their forgotten words, their lost language, their vanished existence. But no records, no ancient texts, no legends had ever described this. This was something else entirely. And then, the voices began. At first, they were just a whisper, soft, distant, impossible to place. A trick of the mind, I told myself, an echo of interference from the storm. But they grew louder, stronger, and then I saw it. Not just the ship, not just the ruins. I saw them. Shadows moving inside the structure. Not people, not silicates, something else, something that should not exist. The Star Seeker shuddered violently, as if the ship itself was trying to pull away, to flee. But it was too late. We had woken something up. The comms crackled to life, though no one had touched them. A voice, hollow, fragmented, ancient, whispered across the speakers. Intrusion detected. Assimilation required. The lights flickered. The shadows inside the structure turned toward us, and the graveyard of ghosts became something else. It became hungry. No one is supposed to survive the outer dissolution. No one is supposed to return from it. But we did, and we brought something back with us. I don't know how we made it out. One moment we were inside the silicate structure, fighting against something we could not understand, something that should not exist. The next, we were adrift, back in real space. The storm was gone. The anomaly was closed behind us. But something had changed. The Star Seeker was no longer the same ship. The stars were no longer the same stars. And I was no longer the same man. I can still hear them. The voices. They whisper in the static of the ship's systems, in the hum of the engines, in the silence between breaths. I hear them in my dreams. And I know they are not gone. We did not escape. We just opened the door for them, and soon they will step through.